Thank you very much. Yeah, so verbs are easily the most complicated structures that I end up using in my technology, and I think they are going to be the most complicated structure in any interactive storytelling technology, because verbs are the core. Crawford's first law of software design is always ask, what does the user do? What are the verbs? And so the verbs are of crucial importance. And verbs in interactive storytelling are intrinsically a lot more complicated than any of the other data structures. So moreover, I found I spend easily 90% of my time when I'm actually building a story world. About 90% of the time goes to working on the verbs. So it's a big problem. Let's see, by the way, I'll just mention, I am developing a new concept called clauses, which should improve the power of verbs, although we don't need any more power, we need simplicity. Anyway, I list a bunch of attributes associated with verbs, and I don't know, any questions about verbs? Did all of that make perfect sense to everyone? Or perhaps, I don't know, it was totally, everyone is totally confused and doesn't even know what kind of question to ask. Let me look over the thing again. There is a bunch of junk I included in the verbs that, by the way, just if you want, just type a question if you have one. There are a bunch of things in the verbs that really I went way too far. For example, I'm not sure if I included it in the, I used to have something called, called spying on. And that was a good example of a trait that, of the standard mistake, which I have made way too many times, and I guarantee you guys will make, and that's, here's another thing that we see in stories that I'd like to have in my story world. Spying on represents something that is very common in drama. It's the guy's walking down the hallway and he passes by a door and he hears some noise and he stops and he listens in the door and he can hear, I'm so mad at you, where's my gun? Oh, I can't find it now. And then the guy walks away and the next day somebody's shot. Aha, the inadvertently overheard. In fact, lack of knowledge is an important element of drama because it allows the revelation of knowledge, which can be of great importance. The standard example of the dramatic significance of revealing new information is the line, "No, I am your father." Okay, fine. There are all sorts of things like that. Another variation on this is the two people sitting at a table talking quietly. Okay, now you'll take care of that, and I'll make sure that the poison is in place by Monday morning, okay? Now the guy says, yeah. And they get up and leave, and then the curtain behind them parts, and somebody goes, very common type of thing. Shakespeare used that trick all the time. So anyway, it is an important element of drama, and so I put it in. I had a mechanism that allowed people to spy on each other, and I never ended up using it. So good example of going too far. Another one that is still listed in there, which goes too far, is the abort feature. Let's see. Guy sees his wife hugging another man. And he gets mad and he says, God damn it. And he goes back and he gets some poison and he, you know, I'm going to pour it into her coffee tomorrow morning. And he pours, in fact, he's getting ready to pour it in. And then she gets a telephone call and she says, yes, Fred, I'm so sorry that your mom died. If you need any more, you know, if you'd like to cry on anybody's shoulder, just come on over anytime. And he realizes, oh no, she wasn't having an affair. And he has to be able to abort the plan to poison her. So I put that in and never, ever used it. So another example of going too far. And there are a million ways to go too far. The problem, I had a good picture that I used to illustrate an important, no, not that. An important point. Let's see, is it, here it is. And no, it's not here. Okay. Well, I don't think I'm gonna, no, that's not it, Chris. I do think this one is important. Where was it? Wait a minute. It might be in here. No. I'm wasting too much time here. It's a drawing of a cat done by a Japanese artist. I'm sure you have seen such images before. It's just a few curved lines that it's obviously a cat, but it is drawn very in a minimalist style. It just traces, you know, the essence of the image of a cat. It strips away all the petty details and gets you down to the, you know, the real fundamentals of what a cat looks like. That's what you have to do with interactive story telling. You've got to strip away as much as possible and get it down to the absolute essentials. And that's the hard part. It is all too easy to add stuff. The really difficult part is figuring out what you can take away and still have a viable story world. So we got some questions from Mark. How do you usually code verb intensity? For example, punching softly versus with force, or does this matter? Yes, this does matter a lot. And in fact, there are two ways to do this. The best way is with what I call a quantifier, which a verb can take as one of its word sockets. So for example, the verb punch will basically have 4 words in the sentence: subject, punch, direct object, intensity or quantifier. So Joe punches Fred this hard. The quantifier is best done as, it works easily in a, using just text, where you have, let's see, not at all, or none, or 0, a little, normal amount, a lot. And then you can do that positive or negative. So you can say, Joe punches Fred hard, or you can say he punches Fred very hard, or a little hard, or not particularly hard. And then at the other end of the extreme, you have a little gently, all the way down to very gently, something like that. Yeah, what's a negative punch? It's easier with, well, see, there are two types of scales here. There's a linear scale, and then there's a bipolar scale, or a unipolar versus bipolar. And in fact, I have ways of dealing with that. In general, bipolar scales require that you have bipolar extremes, and unipolar scales require just a single extreme. Punch is unipolar, so you could just have it as Joe punches Fred almost nothing. Joe punches Fred a little. Joe punches Fred. You don't add anything, and it just means normal, average, every day. Or you could have Joe punches Fred a lot, or very much, or very hard, something like that. There are a bunch of different schemes that are required for these, depending on the nature of the verb, because different types of verbs take different types of intensifiers. But by the way, at one point I had varying degrees of intensifiers. You could have 11-step intensifiers, 9-step, 7-step, 5-step, or even 3-step. You need odd numbers because you got to have a null value in a zero value in the middle. So I had a scheme where you could specify, oh, I want to have a lot of intensifiers for high resolution or very few intensifiers. That was going too far also. I found a 5-step system works very nicely. So let's see. The other way to do intensifiers, there are some types of verbs that just don't take intensifiers very well. Kiss is a good example. You know, you could say, well, they kiss passionately, peck on the cheek, something like that. But it's hard to come up with the words that do that well. So in those cases, I break the verb up into multiple verbs, especially when there are different significances. For example, there are romantic kisses, there are paternal kisses, there are friendly kisses. And so that's best to break up into just completely different verbs. It's decided on a case-by-case basis. Let's see, George asks, could you talk about word sockets versus typed objects? Okay, the typed objects are things like props, actors, stages, and so forth. They end up showing up in the Sappho scripting language, which we'll be taking on next week. Word sockets are a particular type of class or object that only works inside a verb. So a word socket is sort of like a word class. And again, there's some overlap. You can have a word socket for actors, a word socket for props, for stages, but you can also have word sockets including verbs, word sockets including, I should say quantifiers. I keep flipping back and forth between intensifier and quantifier, but quantifier is the better term. By the way, I will mention, since the technology, I've been developing it for 25 years, I do flip back and forth. I have multiple terminologies. For example, I keep talking about actors, when in fact the correct modern technology is characters. It's just that many years ago, we did all the coding in C or C++, and character means something very particular in that language. Whereas nowadays, we don't sweat that so much. So we can use characters to refer to the people in stories. Anyway, let's see, what other word sockets? Oh, I don't specify the types of word sockets. Well, again, those will come up later on. We'll be talking about them when we get into Sappho, because that's where we actually start using word sockets. Let's see, 2, is expression changing depending on which character presenting, or is it changed by a character's personality model? No, the expression is specified by the verb. That is, anybody who's going to punch you, no matter who's doing the punching, they're going to have an angry expression. Anybody who's giving you a gift is going to have a nice, friendly expression. Anybody who's saying, hello there, is going to have that kind of expression. So the expression is specified by the verb, not the character. Let's see. Negative. Some verbs are, yeah, I'm some bipolar. Is it better for verbs to stay unipolar, convert bipolar to unipolar, or something else? In fact, this problem dogged me for the entire time. I ended up having what I call B numbers and U numbers. B numbers are bipolar bounded numbers. U numbers are unipolar bounded numbers. And it turns out you use the B numbers most of the time. But there were times when you just had to have a unipolar number. And quantifiers was usually one of those times. So yeah, most verb quantification is unipolar. It's just that there are a few cases where it's bipolar. You see, I can't make an absolute rule here, because there are always a few exceptions. Does the verb ever command the character to consult the history book you mentioned last week? In the scripts associated with a verb, you may well have to consult the history book in the scripts. And so, yes, the history book is used to help make decisions, and the scripts are where the decisions are made. So, yes, you are going to be consulting the history book. Actually, the most common use of the history book is to make sure you haven't done something previously. One of the problems we had, and I had to build special tools to deal with this, was what we call the loopy booby, where you get caught in a loop where, you know, Joe punches Fred. Fred gets really angry and yells at Joe. That causes Joe to yell at Fred. That causes Fred to punch Joe. That causes Joe to insult and yell at, you know, back and forth and back. They get stuck and in infinite loops. And the history book is one of the easiest ways to, you know, have I punched him in the last 5 minutes? If so, you know, let's escalate now. So that's the most common use of the history book. However, there are a lot of dramatically significant applications of the history book where you'll want to know, gee, have I already warned this guy not to do this anymore? How many times has he called me a jerk? You know, so there are a lot of those things. I will mention, though, that moods are a very quick shorthand for a history book. That is, if you're talking about just short-term reactions, you can use something like anger as a very short-term history book. If you know, one guy keeps insulting the other, the anger level of the other guy keeps going up higher and higher, and that's going to change the way he reacts. So for, you know, the history book really should be used for more longer-term memory issues, but it ends up getting used for a number of different things. So fortunately, again, machines are so fast nowadays. I mean, when we first started off, we noticed some serious time penalties when searching the history book, because oftentimes you'd have to search the whole thing. And if you had gotten, you know, 300 events into a story world, searching every one of those back, you know, 20 some odd years ago could actually take a noticeable fraction of a second. So, and then if you're doing that many times for many different characters, it really adds up. So, are some parts of speech just not worth dealing with, like past perfect? Actually, I don't bother with precise grammar at all. This is an important thing about the language that you use. in fact, I'm writing, right now I'm writing some major stuff on language. And in fact, let me just quickly check where that is. Does, there's the MDA, statements of affinity, nesting clauses, deals. Oh, I haven't done that yet. Okay. Let me explain. Language is the central problem, or I'm sorry, the biggest problem you face in interactive storytelling, because language is the way that people interact. You know, with a shoot 'em up game, you interact with guns or bombs or bows and arrows or knives or whatever. But with storytelling, it's got to be done with language. And in fact, language is entirely sufficient for all storytelling. Witness the fact of novels. We have enormous amounts of literature, language and nothing but language. And you know, so many of our stories are told with language and nothing but language. So yes, language is what we have to use. The problem is we can't do natural language. I might as well go off on this. Have I already given you guys the whole spiel about natural language and Sapir-Whorf and that stuff? I've told you about Sapir-Whorf. Let me plunge into that topic. Have I used the sentence language mirrors reality? Nope. Okay. Yes, language mirrors reality. That is, you can't talk about something if you don't have a word for it. And so language has to have words for the reality you want to talk about, which means language somehow reflects the entire reality in which you live. If it doesn't reflect some part of that reality, then it's insufficient. Somebody will make up a word for it. Beautiful example, which unfortunately is being abused badly. In fact, just in a few years. A new word that hit the English language just a few years ago, gaslight. How many of you have heard that word used as a verb? And tell me, what do you think it means?
My understanding is that gaslighting is when you manage to essentially hijack somebody's perceptions of reality by conditioning them over time to believe that what you say is more accurate than what they say.
Yep, you got it. It's based on a movie from 1941, I think, called Gaslight. And the basic idea was, I think it's a husband and a wife, and she witnesses him doing something very bad. And he then embarks on this thing to convince her that she's actually crazy and didn't really see what she thinks she saw. And somebody leap in and correct me if I'm wrong here, but basically gaslight was initially used to mean attempting to deceive somebody by convincing them, as you said it perfectly well, by convincing them that they are somehow screwed up. Pardon?
Oh, in the movie, he does it by having gas lights that are. I haven't seen it, but as it was described, he gets the lights to do things like flicker periodically, or just go out and come back on. And she'll say, like, "Oh my God, the lights went out again," and he'll just be like, "What? What are you talking about? No, they didn't."
Okay.
It's a very, very common thing for abusive people to do.
Yes.
And for some reason, human brains are hackable.
Yep.
I don't know why, but it works.
It's a very good verb because it does describe a technique used by manipulators to to deceive people. And so it's a beautiful word. Unfortunately, it's starting to get semantic spread. And this always happens to words. It's such a shame. People, there's this nice, clean word that means something very clear, and then people start spreading the meaning. Nowadays, a lot of people use gaslight to mean merely lie. We got a million great words for lying, but only one word for that special technique that manipulative people do. And it's a shame to hear people misuse gaslight to mean lie. I'll give you my particular, this is the one I like to complain about, arrogant. Arrogant comes from the verb arrogate, which means to take to yourself privileges or titles or whatever that you don't really deserve. Unfortunately, people now use arrogant to mean proud. Oh, damn, that's so frustrating, because arrogant had a very nice special meaning, and now it doesn't mean that at all. Anyway, so language, the words in language, we always need new words to reflect the reality. God, there's a great German word that people have started using. I can never remember it. It means taking pleasure to another person's misfortune.
Schadenfreude.
Yes, Schadenfreude. Yes. What a great word. I mean, you
Is it
see it all the
Schadenfreude or
time.
Schadenfreude?
I think it's Schadenfreude.
Okay.
Whatever. The German, they're probably Schadenfreude, Schadenfreude, whatever. Anyway.
Oh, yeah, it does have an E. Okay.
But great word, and it expresses an idea we can't otherwise express. Language is always doing this. And it also, though, specializes. And this got us into a very interesting issue that is now referred to as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It started with, I can never remember, one of them was Benjamin. There was a linguistics professor, Sapir was his name. He studied Hopi Indian language. Now, Hopi is a really weird language because they don't use that many nouns, and their concept of time is not at all the way we do it, and it shows up in their language. And so this guy spent years trying to figure out how Hopi really works. But one of the things, for example, they don't refer to a person as a person, or man or woman. Well, they do have ways of saying that, but the central expression they use is an act of existence of type human. Now it's compressed, it's a lot shorter than that, but basically most things are described as actions of particular types, and they're very verb heavy in their approach. And this in turn, well, his student, Mr. Whorf, then took this even further. Sapir speculated perhaps language affects the way we think. Well, Whorf went a lot further with that and said language controls the way we think. And ever since then, people have argued about that. Now, they've now established clearly language does not control the way you think. It is possible to think almost any thought in any natural language. However, language definitely influences the way we think. The first examples of this were experiments with color. This is a really neat way to measure language. They would take a color palette, you know, like with paint chips. They take a whole bunch of them, and they'd go to New Guinea, and they'd go to a tribe, and they'd show them and say, what colors are these? And they'd say, blue, 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 red, 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 green, 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 so forth. And the interesting thing is that people would group colors. A very common thing was to mix blue and green together. A lot of people don't see any difference between blue and green. They look at it and say, that's all blue. You know, that's just the way they see it. And, you know, when you say, but this is green, they say, no, it's a different shade of blue. And there are all sorts of different variations. In fact, they've done this so much now, they have statistically figured out if a language has only 3 words for colors, those words will be black, white, and I think red. And if it's 4, then it'll be black, white, red, and blue, or, you know, and then if it's 5, 6, 7, they can tell you what is most common. Anyway, where Worf went so they've proven that there is in fact an influence of your language on your perception of color. Another guy went even further though. His stuff is still a bit controversial because it's been hard to reproduce. What he did was he noticed that the Chinese language doesn't have a concise and efficient way to talk about subjunctivity. Subjunctivity is a very special part of language. It's the idea of imagining something that didn't actually happen. And so language can talk about that, you know. What if everybody in the world were nice? You know, then when the world, and we can talk about all of that stuff, you know. What if I took the test tomorrow instead of today? You know, there are a million of these speculative scenarios. Well, in most of the Indo-European languages, this is done with the particle we call if. If this, then that. And most languages have a way of addressing that very neatly. In Chinese, though, it's really clumsy. The way Chinese sentences are put together, you gotta talk around it a lot to get across the idea. And so this guy gave tests. He was in Taiwan, and he broke his students up into 3 groups. 1, students who spoke English only, students who spoke Chinese only, students who spoke both English and Chinese. And then he gave all 3 groups the same basic test. It would have questions like, if Al Gore had been elected president in 2000, would the US have invaded Iraq? Classic example of a subjunctive idea. And what he found was that the pure English speakers all said, well, no, or probably not, or unlikely, or whatever. The pure Chinese speakers really got confused over that and had a lot of problems with it. Some of them did answer it correctly, but most of them said, but Al Gore wasn't elected. So that's a nonsense question. And then the people who spoke both languages scored in between the 2 extremes. So this is a good example of how language definitely influences thinking. So no, language, if people tell you that Sapir-Whorf has been disproven, what they're saying is the strict form of Sapir-Whorf has been disproven. Language does not control the way you think, but the soft form, it definitely influences the way you think. Okay, the significance of all of this is that, again, language reflects reality, and therefore, if you want to put language in a computer, you're going to have to put reality into the computer too. And then that raises the question, well, you know, reality is kind of big, you know. Can you imagine the data structure for reality? You know, class, reality, consisting of class, planets, stars, galaxies, colleges, games, athletics. It could go. This is impossible. There's no way you can fit reality. Even the reality that an individual perceives, you just can't fit it inside a computer. Not now. But now this is all very well-known stuff. If you guys have taken computer science, I'm sure somebody, when you took your class in language handling, they told you about knowledge domains. The idea is if you restrict your discussion to a small closed knowledge domain, then you can build software that understands natural language. For example, Siri, what's a good Chinese restaurant nearby?
Okay, here's what I found.
Easy. So because restaurants and the types of restaurants and physical location, that's easy. That's a very small knowledge domain. So we could do that. On the other hand, if I were to ask Siri, what do you think the motivations of Darth Vader were in attacking the rebellion?
I don't have an answer for that. Is there something else I can help with?
No, thank you. If it's a big knowledge domain, it can't handle it. So, yes, you can put small knowledge domains inside a computer. You can't put big knowledge domains, which means you can't handle natural language in its full sense. And the problem is, how do you do a story world with a small knowledge domain? I mean, human relationships are big. They're not small. There are a few tricks you could use. One of the best would be to cut it down to children. Children have much simpler relationships. So maybe if you had a story world about 5-year-olds interacting, that's a small knowledge domain. Or a cartoon environment, where there are little balls bouncing around. In fact, some guys at MIT, many years ago, did a very interesting thing where they just had balls bouncing around, bumping into each other and moving towards and away each other. And people sort of, it was an experiment in storytelling. But yes, if you use cartoon creatures, you can restrict the knowledge domain and end up with something that is possibly manageable. Another way to do it is with simplified languages. And that does have a problem if you try to use English, only you're going to use a subset of it, you're going to get in big trouble, very big trouble very quickly, because people will not know what the limits of your English are. Classic example of this is a text adventure game got 30 years ago, I think, where you walked into a room and it said, there's a window, there's a rock laying on the floor, blah, blah, blah. And later on, if you said, pick up rock, it would say, huh? And you say, kick rock. And it would say, huh? And you tried everything. It turned out there'd been a mistake somewhere and you had to pick up stone, not rock. This is the type of problem you can get when you're using a limited knowledge domain with an unlimited language. So what do? You need a simplified language. And that gets us into, I tried to do that with a symbolic or iconic language, and I've done a lot of stuff with that. And I can tell you a great deal about it if you want, but I won't do that right now. Let me answer some more questions here. I will. Wait a minute, why was I talking about language? There was another point I wanted to make about it. Oh, well, by the way, I'll also mention, in fact, I expect to get in the mail today a book. Somebody came up with a very interesting language. In fact, have you ever heard of the word conlang? This is a weird little corner of the internet.
Yeah, constructed language, right?
Yeah.
Like Klingon or Tolkienian Elvish.
Yes,
just
yes,
made
yes,
up.
yes. I mean, you know how every programmer likes to create his own programming language? Every linguistics student wants to create his own natural language. And these are called constructed languages. And there are millions of these things, you know, like Klingon or
Proto-Indo-European, which has less right to exist than Klingon. Oh, whoops, sorry. Was I getting my bad? Step away from the soapbox.
Come on, George, whatever his name is, who did Star Wars, he had this thing about language, and so he insisted that every species have their own little language, and he actually hired linguists who would cook up these languages for all the different species. And so when people spoke in these languages, it wasn't just garbledy garbledy gobble blah blah blah. They would actually have a script of these nonsense words, but they all were designed. Anyway, people love doing this, and there are millions of these conlangs. Every one of them has some particular point or focus, just like with programming languages. You know, BASIC was meant to be really easy to learn. Forth was meant to be very compact and concise. APL, that's a wild one. Anyway, there are all these languages. Each has its special strengths that it was designed around. Same thing with the conlangs. And our problem is that we need a language that can be used for interactive storytelling that's small, yet covers the dramatic universe, which sounds impossible. However, oh, by the way, did I show you guys this or talk about this? I didn't. Oh.
Golden Book of the Little Mermaid?
Yeah.
All the verbs in The Little Mermaid?
Yes, yes. This is The Little Mermaid. A truly fine piece of literature. You know, there's this, wait, in fact, let me get the right thing.
Does it tell the Disney version, or does it tell the Hans Christian Andersen version?
Hans Christian Andersen version with Disney.
The Disney.
I know, right?
Yeah.
I'd go buy that right now.
The tragic story of a young girl who's in deep Freudian conflict with her father, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I went through here counting the unique verbs. If a different form of the same verb appeared, I didn't count it. 122 different verbs in this. Now, if this story needs 122 verbs, what does that tell you about the number of verbs you're going to need for a story world? In fact, wait, it wasn't one of the guys here, was it? Who did no, it wasn't. Somebody from the other class actually did an analysis of about a dozen novels he was able to get the text for, counting verbs. And the smallest one had about 1,100 verbs in it, and the biggest one had about 3,000, I think. So, yeah, we're going to need a lot of verbs. Anyway, I've been looking closely at small languages, and a lot of them don't work, like Basic English turns out to be a fake. Sol-Risol, very interesting language, weird. You can speak you can sing Sol-Risol, you can write it, you can do it with colors, it's really wild. But there's another one that I'm just getting a book about today that looks like it's based on Taoism, the minimalist philosophy of Taoism expressed in a language. Very interesting. Another beautiful example. Did you see the movie Arrival, about the linguist and the weird spaceship that comes down?
Oh yeah, that was solid.
And the circular language. I actually got into, I dug around on the internet and found some more stuff on that. And that was a brilliant design. It really was just so clever. Anyway, so languages are very important. We are going to be struggling with languages in interactive storytelling for many years because until we can do natural language, we're going to have problems. Okay, let's see the next thing. Let me answer some questions and then I better talk about roles. Let's see. Would it be worth simulating each actor's individual memories instead of one general history book allowing for actions? Oh, that's already handled in my history book design. In one of the data structures for the history book is who knows about this event. And so you can then specify that only the witnesses know it, but then you can get into all sorts of complexity where people tell each other about events. So somebody can find out about it. That's a whole nother area that I haven't gotten into. In fact, let me ask you guys right now, one of the reasons I haven't gotten into a lot of details about my technology is that I don't want to cram it down your throats. That is, I want to inspire you with a lot of interesting ideas, but I don't want to drag you into all the details of my technology so that you think only in terms of my technology. Any thoughts on what the proper balance here is between just vague inspiration and specific details to show how it's done?
History, there's always history. So I found the history and the personality models and the verbs, like, because they're going to be constants. Like, no matter what, we're going to have a character doing something or remembering something.
Yeah. Any other comments on that problem?
Perhaps it might be if you could throw a software that we could play with.
Yes, I will be doing that a little later. I'm actually doing a little cleaning up of the stuff. It's in Java, I'll warn you, so you better be set up to run Java. And it is big and complicated, and if I gave it to you right now, it would just, you know, it would just confuse you. And we are getting into that, and in fact, I am also modifying the course. Originally, the course was much more generalized, but I found people are getting more and more interested in the specifics of the technology, so I'm writing more and more stuff about that. So yes, we will get there. What are methods of character-driven event generation? How to pick the next event? You mentioned you don't like random rolls. Why is rolling off a probability the wrong move? Okay. The first step in a verb turns into an event. That is, we had this verb, punch, and then Joe punches Fred hard. That's a sentence, an event. And that goes into the history book. But when it executes, when it actually happens, Fred got punched, then the first thing we do is apply the roles to it. The role in this technology is a way of specifying the dramatic relationship between a character and the event. And so the most common role is direct object. Joe punches Fred. Joe's the subject. Fred is the direct object. I mean, almost 90% of your stuff goes that way. But you could also have other roles. For example, suppose this is a, Western movie type scenario. They're in the saloon. Joe punches Fred. Well, you could have Fred's best friend there, Tom. And so Tom jumps up and punches Joe. So we have a different role there. That's best friend of direct object. You could have direct object's girlfriend. That's a role. Nell. And Nell says, "Oh, please don't fight." Very different dramatic context for her. You could have the sheriff. That's a very different role. And so the sheriff would say, all right, you guys, cut that crap out. So this is what roles are. This is lesson 14. And they, in effect, specify a dramatic relationship to an event. And they are triggered, they have Boolean definitions. So in order for somebody to fill the sheriff role, they have to witness it, obviously, that applies to all of them. And they have to be the sheriff. So that's an easily defined role. Same thing with, say, girlfriend of direct object is, the girlfriend of the direct object. There is this character, the girlfriend of the direct object. So basically, what you're going to do when an event takes place, you're going to go through all of the characters in the whole story world. And the first question you ask is, are they on the same stage? Do they witness this? Meaning, are they on the same stage? If they are, then you say, okay, which role do they fill? And you have to go through every one of the roles and say, okay, here's the Boolean statement for this role. Plug in the values. Do you get true? If so, that's the role you're doing. If not, move to the next role. And so for every character who's there, you have to test again. Well, you can actually abort it. You test for a role until they fit one, and then you stop testing. You can't fill two roles at once. So anyway, that's the first level of decision making. In the next level, before we can go to the next level, though, we got to talk about Sappho. And that's the scripting language I built. It's my own programming language. Everybody likes to write their own programming language. And oh yes, mine is so superior. It is specialized to the particular problems of interactive storytelling, and as such, it has a lot of really neat features. So, but if you want to calculate the value of pi, I'm sorry. Well, I suppose you could do it, but boy, that'd be a big job. Anyway, let's see. So, any other questions?
Any progress with the personality, the multi-dimensional thing?
Oh, yes. Thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah, the MDA. Ivan is actually, he said he would be starting work on it today. I have continued to work on it and refine it. Although damn it, I have not done any work on it in several days. So it is, oh boy. Oh, yes, here we go. Here's the URL for the latest version, although I have a great deal more work to do on that. But Ivan is writing the code for what'll happen on the web, and I will have to start writing the analysis code, which is pretty hairy statistical stuff. But we now have a pretty nice user interface, I believe. And I'll be leaning on you guys to recruit your friends, family, people on the street, whatever, because we want a lot of people in on this. But it does have a fairly nice user interface now. And but it won't be ready for a while. I don't want to press Ivan. This is a big programming job, and I want to give him all the time he wants. So it is continuing to make progress, though, and my job for now is just building more of the character images. So, because I'm going to need nearly 100 of these damn things, and each one has to be built by hand in a photo manipulation program. So, oh wait, here's another. Not only do you need to run DOSBox to play, yes, that's true. The C-boot has its own little conlang. Fortunately, the original C-boot did have, it was very easy. That language, you could pick that up in 10 minutes. Very simple. Oh, and I didn't answer the question why I don't like probability. The most important, well, first, it's unnecessary. Probability is really a way of simulating complexity. You got all the complexity you want, so you don't need probability, random numbers. But more important, you need to be able to reproduce problems. That is, when you run a rehearsal on a story world, you really need to be able to go back afterwards and figure out why something strange happened. And random numbers tend to get in the way. Now, if you use a proper random number generator with your own seed, you can still get away with that. In fact, I have a random number generator, and I think a random operator in my technology. It's just that I don't use it. I found no need whatever for it. So there's the cat's tail. Go on, cat. So I found that the random number generator just tends, or random numbers create unnecessary variation when you're going to have an enormous amount of variation anyway. So don't make matters worse. Last questions? Okay, then. Well, we are done, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.